Nous allons maintenant débuter les conférences de cette première séance d'ouverture du colloque avec M. Sebastjan Voros, professeur adjoint à la faculté des arts de l'Université de Ljubljana en Slovénie. Il propose une conférence introductive qui nous mènera à la conférence d'ouverture de M. Michel Bitbol. Donc, j'invite M. Voros à partager son écran. Merci.
So, hello everyone. I'm really happy to be here, so thank you very much for inviting me. I was asked to deliver an introductory, an introduction to the key speaker today, so who will be Michel Bitbol, and also to deliver a preliminary talk on enaction. Now, before I start, I would like to qualify my talk a little bit. Namely, as you can see already from the very title, which was taken from the famous book by Jacob van Uxküll, the original translation into English, which was A Stroll Through the Worlds of Animals and Men. So this talk is called A Casual Stroll Through and Around the World of Enaction. So the talk will be very introductory indeed. So I will briefly delineate the background to enaction, so how it developed and its characteristics, its implications. From what I understood when we were talking about this talk is to really kind of lay the foundations to provide a very fundamental account of what enaction is. So I sincerely hope that some of the big shots in the enaction community will not find particularly or too boring, and that it will indeed lay the grounds for the upcoming lectures. So if I start, just a second. Okay, yeah. So the notorious little booklet called Communist Manifesto, written by Marx and Engels, opens with the famous lines, as you know, probably, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism." Now, some of the more classically, that is to say, cognitivistically minded people in cognitive science and philosophy of mind might feel the same for what's happening currently in their own respective disciplines. Namely, one could say that there is a revolution, e-revolution happening, that a e-revolution is afoot, and that the barbarians and revolutionaries, many of whom, by the way, will also be presenting at this conference, are no longer at the gates, but rather, as it seems, occupying cafes in the heart of the very city. So what is this infamous e-revolution? Well, it basically consists of a radical reconceptualization, or an attempt at a radical reconceptualization of cognition and mind in terms of the so-called 4 E's. Namely, it's an attempt to construe the mind as embodied, embedded, extended, and enacted. Now, it would seem that new E's are being constantly added to the bunch. So nowadays you can also hear the talk about mind being ecological, experiential, emotive, and so on and so forth. And every now and again, even a new letter drops in. So sometimes an A is added, so mind as affective. But the main idea is that something was dreadfully wrong with how mind was conceived of before. And this is something that I would like to present today. And of course, I will be focusing on the last part, so the mind as enacted. The provisional itinerary of my talk is as follows. It's fairly simple. So at the beginning, I will just briefly delineate the historical conceptual background in which the notion of enaction developed. Then I will focus on the enaction itself, its characteristics, implications, and so on and so forth. And then I will move on to the presentation, a brief presentation of Michel Bitbol, who, among other many things, is an active figure, a tremendously active and important figure in the enactivist movement. Now, since both myself and Michel were mostly influenced by the Vörösian tradition in enaction, I will address what this means towards the end of the talk. I have mostly, although not solely, structured my talk around the accounts that are provided in the two, I would say, very famous, even classical books now, The Embodied Mind from 1991 by Varela, Thompson, and Roche, and the follow-up book by Evan Thompson, Mind in Life from 2007, I think. And I've also drawn on several Francisco Varela's papers from the late 80s and the early 90s. Usually, enaction, as you know, is presented in the context of cognitive or mind sciences, as they're sometimes called. So these are the sciences which Gardner characterized as sciences with a very long past, but a relatively short history. The reason for this characterization is that the topics, themes, debates, and issues that have emerged in the wake, for instance, in the wake of this enactivist or enactive turn, are actually of a way older date. So one can find these disputes already in the philosophical arena way before, way earlier than that. And there were also very lively debates that were very similar to what's happening now, say in the context of cognitive science in the late 19th and the early 20th century German and French natural sciences, particularly the fields of psychology and biology. And this is nicely captured by the famous Jerry Fodor's thought, where he says that in intellectual history, everything happens twice, first as philosophy and then as cognitive science. Now, cognitive science probably doesn't need an introduction, so just very briefly, it's an attempt to somehow bring mind and cognition under the purview of natural sciences. That is to say, an attempt to naturalize in one way or another, although that's a very tricky term, cognition and mind. It has never become a unified discipline, although this was the original attempt. So as I think Varela, Thompson, and so on rightly point out, it's a very diverse discipline. So it's more akin to a federation of disciplines than a unified science. And there are, of course, several poles of domination. Now, an interesting move or shift happened from at around, I would say, 90s, when the predominant role moved from artificial intelligence to neuroscience. And as we will see later on, this has had a very important effect, and it is reflected also in the enactive movement. Now, the way this picture or this story, this narrative is presented is as follows, and this is a bit of a schematic presentation, as all of these presentations necessarily are, but it will do for an introductory presentation. So usually the history of cognitive science is briefly summarized by 4 consecutive phases, which are not really consecutive, but are closely, strongly intertwined, so they're not discrete phases neatly cut off from one another. At the very beginning, we usually find the cybernetics era, which is characterized normally as a prehistory of cognitive science. So in the Kuhnian sense, this would be a pre-paradigmatic period of cognitive science. So the period where there was no unified paradigm. And this period was usually, it's depicted as very conceptually extremely rich, brimming with new ideas, which is actually a nice way of saying that people were just all over the place and they were exploding with various ideas, notions that they wanted to explore. So several paradigmatic alternatives were afloat, and the early enactive theorists normally tended to gravitate back towards these days, and they were quite enamored by them, one could say. So they looked upon these early times as times where a lot of interesting ideas were present, and also a lot of missed opportunities. Then the first move, so the first step happens in around 1950s, 1960s, where the cognitive science gets its first paradigm. So this is the famous or infamous cognitivism, of which I will say more later on. This is the first paradigm proper, or I would actually prefer the term used by Ludwig Fleck, unfortunately not particularly well-known Polish philosopher of science and microbiologist, who used the term thought or cognitive style. So there's a specific way of thinking, specific way of seeing things that gets deeply ingrained in us, and we see certain things from a very, very specific perspective. So we see specific Gestalten almost as self-evident. And the following two moves were basically two reactions. Sorry for this. Two reactions to the cognitivist paradigm, to its two main tenets, namely the idea of symbolic calculation and representation. So the emergence paradigm, if we can call it that, is basically nowadays known by the name of connectionism. It provides an alternative to symbolic computation, and enaction then tries to get rid of representations. That's a very brief summary. Now, as I've said, the picture is a lot more complicated than that. So this is the image that is provided in several of Francisco Varela's texts, where you can see that we have nested circles, as he calls them, which are, as mentioned, closely interrelated, and they interpenetrate, so to speak, so that the image is not nearly as clear-cut as one might think if one sees only the first presentation in 3 or 4 consecutive steps. Now, I won't be talking about the first cybernetics era, but I would warmly recommend a fabulous book by Jean-Pierre Dupuy on the origins of cognitive science, the mechanization of the mind. If anybody's interested in this topic, it covers this era extremely well, and also brings forth different philosophical frameworks and horizons that were present, and what their implications was, why eventually one got chosen, and what would happen if a different path were taken. So let us very briefly take a look at cognitivism. So in the 1950s and 1960s, during a series of conferences and several publications, what happened was what Gardner called the unofficial launching of cognitive science. And this is basically the cognitivist approach was developed. And this cognitivist revolution is usually depicted as a reaction to the then predominant behaviorism, with which cognitivism actually shares more than it is usually willing to admit, especially the overall or the broad aim or goal to mechanize the mind, and in the way it conceives of the mental states and processes. However, usually the way that this story is presented is that with cognitivism, finally the black box of the mind was opened, and the scientists and philosophers were no longer forced to just study behavior as that which supposedly exhausts the domain of cognition, but could actually start talking about the processes that are actually happening within the mind. The main idea was here that cognition is information processing, which consists of symbolic computation and representation. I'll say more about these later on. And the overall approach is encapsulated in a maxim given by Francisco Varela in one of his papers. The brain processes information from the outside world. So a very familiar, very simple notion or idea. Now, it is good to try to capture these approaches via their dominant or predominant metaphors, because metaphors tend to play a significantly greater role in science than scientists and philosophers of science are usually willing to admit. Namely, they allow us to capture a unique tone or style of a specific way of thinking that becomes prevalent, that becomes predominant. And this is, I think, it's very telling that it is at this point that the mind was conceived as a digital computer, so as a symbol manipulating machine. And Rosenberg already in 1970s called this computer gestalt, which I find really extremely fitting, because just as we, when we open our eyes, are presented with gestalten, with these structurations and formations that are simply there and they simply seem self-evident, the same happens once one acquires a specific thought style, of which I was talking about earlier on. So you start not only thinking about things in a specific way, but actually seeing them. They just become self-evident. And there are just so many examples in the history of science that could be mentioned here. So yeah, basically the idea is that cognition is information processing. At the beginning, sometimes it was mentioned as a metaphor. Eventually it became actually a descriptive designation, so that cognition is in fact information processing. And in one of the texts, Francisco explains this with a slightly strange phrase, perhaps, calculation of symbols, but it's actually very fitting. So what does calculation of symbols mean? Symbols are simply items that are that have a physical form. That is to say, they're physically, say, neurophysiologically instantiated, and they stand for something. So they represent something in the world. And then calculation is basically various formal, syntactic, algorithmic operations that are being done on these symbols. So in short, cognition is formal or algorithmic manipulation of symbolic representations. That's the main idea. Another somewhat oversimplified scheme is this, so that information processing is characterized by three features: that cognition is linear, that is to say it happens in successive steps. It is local, so it follows specific localized rules and functions, and it is related to representation. So at the core of this approach is the idea of mind being the mirror of nature, as Rorty calls this. That is to say, mind is something that represents the external, predetermined, pre-existing world. And this then, in a nutshell, would be what Dennett called High Church of Computationalism, preaching the gospel of boxology. Why boxology? Because of all these neat, well-structured, well-delineated boxes where you have everything in place, everything in order. This approach is very nicely presented with this image from the Tree of Knowledge, where we have the Caesar who sees an outside object, here an eagle, and then once a symbolic representation is formed in his brains, this goes through a series of successive formal operations, and eventually leads to the activation of series of muscular contractions, which makes the Caesar say Aquila, so eagle. Now, the second paradigm, the first reaction to the computationalist paradigm, is the so-called emergence. And the main idea here is a move away from the digital computer and seeking inspiration in the biological systems, more specifically in the neuronal system. So here the main metaphor become neural networks. So these are usually artificial networks, virtual systems that run on digital computers. And the more common name for this approach is connectionism, which has, of course, several offsprings, so machine learning and nowadays deep learning, and there are ongoing debates to what degree these are compatible with enactivism and to what degree they salvage certain problems or solve certain problems that were brought forth against them in these early periods and so on and so forth. So why this reaction? Why did this alternative approach emerge? By the way, this alternative approach was actually an approach that was already present during the cybernetics period. So, you know, this is one of the examples why Varela, for instance, found going back to these early days was so fascinating, because many of the models, or at least conceptual frameworks, were present already back then. Well, one of the reasons is definitely the wish or desire to introduce more plasticity into cognitive systems. So although the cognitivist approaches or cognitivist systems and models were very robust, they were a bit akin to that, you know, almost proverbial boyfriend who is very structured and very organized, but extremely dull and extremely rigid. So it would seem that natural cognitive systems were behaving in a significantly more plastic, flexible, dynamic manner, and that they were able to compensate for various localized breakdowns and whatnot. So here cognition becomes related to stable emergent patterns. It is no longer related to symbolic computation. And this is the aspect that most fascinated the early enactivist thinkers. So this idea that from distributed local processes, you can get an emergence of global, stable global patterns. So very briefly, what we have here, as I said, is not a digital computer, but a neural network, which is a network of interconnected components, where you have various layers of simple nodes, that is to say, simple neural-like items or units, and these are linked by weighted connections. And the connection strength, so the strength between the connections between these nodes changes according to specific learning rules that are introduced into the network, and by history of the activity. So the way that the network itself restructures itself in every cycle. And after a while, the whole network, that is to say, the whole system, converges or gravitates towards a particular cognitive performance. I will skip this quote. Okay, so instead of linear and local processing, what we get here is something that is more dispersed. So we get parallel and distributed processes, and there is a shift towards the system as a whole. So not to specific modules or specific discrete segments in the mind that operate, but to the system as a whole. So it's a more of a holistic conception, which becomes even more radicalized later on with the introduction of the enactivist approach. And when I'm talking about holistic, this is to be understood without any esoteric or explicitly esoteric under or overtones. So one thing that I forgot to mention on this slide is also that history becomes important. So the history of the system, as I mentioned, becomes relevant. So the developmental evolutionary aspect, if you like, is introduced into the story, whereby you don't have these predetermined, formed functions just being there, lying there, but they are something that develops in a specific context and in answer or in response to a specific problem. And a very neat way of presenting this is that cognition here is no longer akin to a chain of command, but it becomes more similar to a cocktail party conversation where you have several people talking with each other, but still what you get is an emergent narrative that is fairly stable. Okay, something has just shifted. I hope everything is okay. What is still remains here, however, is representation. So the representations are still in the picture. They still haven't been taken out, so to speak. As usually the enactivist theorists point out, there is still something artificial because the problems are brought to these networks from the outside, the proper solutions are determined from the outside, and so on and so forth. So there are some interesting points that could be made from a Canguilhemian perspective about this being the most teleological approach, but yeah, we can maybe address this at some other point. Anyway, and now we finally arrived to the enaction. So as I've mentioned, the early enactivist theories were greatly inspired by this emergence or connectivist approach, especially the ideas about the dynamic relationship between parts and wholes and the constitution of the emergent wholes. But they still felt that something was missing, that the whole picture was insufficient. There was something artificial about it. And the problem was that these processes that lead to these emergent global structures just ignore the context in which this happens in living cognizing systems. So there is not enough emphasis is given on the fact that they occur in the context of, or in the horizon of, organic or organismal wholes that are actively engaged with their environments. So instead of having predetermined problems with predetermined solutions, what is needed is a way to come to a system which brings forth its own problems and brings about its own solutions, which then of course can become sedimented and become standardized and so on and so forth. But there has to be this creative moment which seems to be lacking in the previous pictures. So what would be the motivation? Well, the fact that cognitive beings are in fact usually living, that is to say, active, dynamic, processual beings. So beings in which it would seem that action is a constitutive segment of their being, and that action should be considered as constitutive of cognition. Now, before I go into enaction, maybe a few brief words on just a second. Okay, I didn't see, sorry for this. I didn't see that you asked me to slow down. Okay, I'll try to do so.
No, it's perfect. It's perfect now. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry for this. I don't see the chat. I just saw the number. Okay, so the influences, very, very brief presentation of the influences. There are several. The ones that I forefront here are the ones that Francisco Varela explicitly mentions in his text. So the cybernetic tradition, which I already mentioned, although it should be added that the second order cybernetics that was introduced by people like von Förster was of particular importance. Then, of course, there's the famous and now well-known phenomenological and hermeneutical contribution of thinkers like such as Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger, and even Gadamer, Sartre, and others. There's also historical epistemology, which curiously usually in these portrayals and depictions usually gets a bit of a short shrift, although Francisco Varela explicitly mentions that Coiré had a very, very profound effect on him, as well as Bachelard and Canguilhem. And these are, Canguilhem will be one of the authors that I will be using in my next lecture on Wednesday. And then there's, of course, Buddhist philosophy, particularly the philosophy of the famous originator of the Madhyamaka school, Nagarjuna, and the Tibetan tradition, which is basically founded on Nagarjuna's thought. There are, of course, many others, other influences, some of them explicit, some of them implicit. For instance, one can trace the influence of pragmatism, of holistic biology, Wittgenstein, and so on and so forth. But the main issues, so the main point or the main characteristic, the main common thread that one finds running through these various influences is precisely a philosophical problematization of something that seems self-evident. So this, these self-evident truisms, so to speak, about the nature of a cognizing being and how it fits into the world. Yes. Okay. So one of the things that is important in relation to enaction is that cognition all of a sudden is no longer limited to the head or the brain, but becomes related to the organism as a whole, nay, what is more, to organism as it copes with its environment. So cognition here becomes construed, it is usually portrayed as embodied action, and this is supposed to stand for inaction. By the way, as an interesting side note, it should be mentioned that Francisco Varela was never particularly satisfied with this designation. So initially he wanted to call his approach hermeneutical, as Evan Thompson pointed out in one of the seminars in the past. And he always felt that enaction was actually a compromise of sorts and not a particularly good one. So, but okay, let's try to break this down. If enaction is embodied action, what does this mean? Well, embodied, the notion of embodied means that it pertains to the living bodies, which are understood not as assembly of parts, so not as assembly of discrete, separate, isolated anatomical / physiological parts, but as autonomous wholes. So there is a very pronounced anti-reductionist segment or element to this. And this, of course, goes back to Francisco Varela's early work in the field of autonomous and autopoietic systems, that is to say, systems that self-produce, that self-govern. I'm pretty sure that everybody more or less knows about this, but there's this interesting interrelation between parts and wholes, where you have parts which are only parts in the setting of the whole, and the whole which actualizes or realizes itself only in and through the parts. So the processes, for instance, in a cell, metabolic processes produce the boundary, and this boundary then becomes the condition of the possibility for these metabolic processes to take place in the first place. So there is a certain interesting circular, or as Varela sometimes says, dialectical relationship between parts and wholes, which is of interest here. And this already brings us to the second aspect, namely, why action? Well, living bodies are not just autonomous wholes, but they are dynamic wholes. So for living bodies, action is constitutive of their being. It is stasis means death for the living beings. And I would like to read a short quote here by Brady from, that quote is taken from a lovely paper called Form and Cause in Goethe's Morphology, where Brady says, "The forms of life are not finished work, but always forms becoming, and their potency to do otherwise is an immediate aspect of their internal constitution, a necessity to change in order to remain the same." So the living beings need to change in order to remain the same, so that to keep on living. And the basic idea behind enaction is that living beings, these autonomous wholes, enact both themselves and their milieu. So they enact themselves as normative centers, as centers which determine or at least contribute to how they will respond to specific influences from the outside. But because with every, they never coalesce with what is given at a specific time, so with the actuality that they present at a specific time, they're always also beyond themselves. And in this sense, they kind of project into the surrounding, into their into the milieu, as it's called. So the living bodies, in their ongoing attempt to maintain their internal coherence, project outside of themselves a milieu, or as it is sometimes called, Umwelt, which is a domain of significance. That is to say, a domain of significant structures for that organism, of structures which are relevant for that organism to maintain its organization. And perhaps an interesting note here, this means that organisms are never fully centered in themselves. There is always something milieu-like to the organism, and always something organism-like in the milieu. There is a very famous example of sucrose here, where sucrose as a specific molecule is not pertinent for the organism merely for its chemical, because of its chemical structure, but it has to do with the specific state in which the organism finds itself. So it is not necessarily a given entity itself as depicted in a certain physical chemical account that is relevant, but a certain relation that becomes established between it and the living organism. So cognition, again, embodied action or inaction. And now we've seen that cognition, according to this account, is closely related to living. In fact, there was a very strong emphasis on this continuity or a structural similarity in the enactivist tradition, where there was talk about mind-life continuity and so on and so forth. And the main point here is that representation is cast aside, and instead the notion of sense-making or bringing forth a world, bringing forth a milieu or a meaningful domain becomes more important. So instead of talking about informations coming from the outside, Varela would sometimes talk about organisms informing themselves. That is to say, they constitute normative wholes which determine conditions of possibility for their persistence, and in this sense they form themselves and also determine in what way, or at least contribute to what way, they will respond to the outside influences. Now, moving on to the present time, there are a lot of approaches that go by the name of enaction and enactivism nowadays. Some of them are closer to what I've just presented. Some of them have taken some of the ideas that I've presented and put them into a somewhat different setting. So what I here call hermeneutical enactivism, in line with what I've just said, what I've said before. So this is the type of enactivism that Thompson, Di Paolo, Vörös, and so on and so forth develop. This is still very much in the vein of what I've presented. Sensory motor enactivism puts most emphasis on these sensory motor loops, and is already in a certain sense different, because it is not really interested in some of the topics that usually the hermeneutical enactivism is. And then there's also, I don't know, I would call it, they call themselves radical enactivists. I have a bit of an issue with that designation, so I just refer to them here as analytic or maybe functionalist enactivism, presented by Hutto and Mein, and I'm pretty sure that we'll be able to learn a lot about this approach in the later presentations, which has basically taken some of the ideas of enactivism, the notion of inaction, and embedded it into the more classical debates in the analytic philosophy of mind. Now, one thing that I would like to mention before I wrap this up and then move on to the short presentation of Michel is the thing. So one thing which I have basically avoided, or not, I haven't mentioned till now, but actually plays an extremely important role in the enactive tradition. Namely, it's the following. if living is closely related or even identical to cognition, and if cognition or cognizing is basically an action, this has interesting consequences for the relationship of, say, science or any cognizing agent. So not only do we apply these terms, these notions to the observed phenomena, so the living organisms, so the objects of our inquiry, we observe living organisms that interact or engage with their environments, but also the scientist, him or herself, is a living organism, and therefore also in a certain sense enacts an environment of sorts. So cognition there is also in action, and this opens up a whole can of worms, epistemological, like a whole can of epistemological and ontological worms. But the main point here is that all of a sudden lived experience of that particular observer, of that particular cognizer, becomes relevant. So cognition does not simply happen somewhere, but it is something that is closely related to the lived experience. So the Umwelt of a cognizer, of a human cognizer, is also his or her Lebenswelt, so his or her life world. And this has led to a renewed, revitalized interest in the study of lived experience, which is why the enactive tradition has contributed significantly to different disciplines that are trying to do this, to bring investigation of experience in one way or another under the umbrella of contemporary science. So we have approaches like neurophenomenology, first-person inquiry, such as microphenomenology, contemplative inquiry. So there was this, there have been these interesting, although I would argue very problematic, attempts to establish a fruitful bridge between contemplative traditions, especially Buddhism, and science, and so on and so forth. So as we mentioned at the very beginning, we said that an e-revolution is afoot, and that this e-revolution is related to the attempt to construe or conceive of cognition and mind as embodied, embedded, extended, and enacted. Now we understand better what this means. So the mind is embodied, it is enacted, it is extended because it extends beyond the limits of the skull, and it is embedded in its surrounding, in its environment, in its milieu. How these things are construed is still debated, but this is the gist of the main idea. Okay, now to the last but definitely not least segment of my talk. Michel, and I hope that he doesn't mind that I call him by his first name here, has been a key figure, I would say, in the enactivist movement. And not only was he inspired by the enactivist tradition, but has himself contributed greatly to the enactivist tradition, and almost on all levels. So he published on autopoiesis and autonomous systems, on enaction embodiment, on the first person research, and also on the relationship between enaction, or the introduction of the notion of enaction in the context of natural sciences, particularly physics. And this will be, if I understood the overview correctly, also the main topic of his talk today. Now, very briefly, very brief presentation, if I can actually get this to work. So Michel is an emeritus researcher at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, France. He received an MD and PhD in physics and a habilitation in philosophy. After a start in scientific research, he turned to philosophy of science, editing texts by Erwin Schrödinger and formulating a neo-Kantian philosophy of quantum mechanics. He then studied the relations between physics and the philosophy of mind in collaboration with Francisco Varela, and drew a parallel between Buddhist dependent arising, so the Buddhist notion of dependent arising or codependent arising, and non-supervenient relations with quantum physics. He also developed a first-person conception of consciousness expressed from the standpoint of an experience of meditation. And more recently, he has been engaged in several other debates, among others in a debate with the so-called speculative realists. Now, Michel has published on many different topics, and he has co-authored several, co-authored, and edited numerous volumes, some of which you can see on this slide. And as mentioned, he has been extremely active participant, not only in the enactivist community, but also in several other domains of research and discussion. But one of the things that I would perhaps like to underscore before I wrap this up is that Michel is also one of those few academics today who not only outstanding scholars, but who also embody or do their best to try to embody and enact what Pierre Hadot called philosophy as a way of life. That is to say, an attempt to pursue a philosophical life or a life devoted to wisdom and virtue. Now, virtue sounds strange nowadays. It sounds extremely anachronistic, but the way I'm using the word here is in the old Greek sense of arete, which means excellence. So basically, it is a life devoted to the pursuit of excellence in all endeavors, in all domains. Anyway, I'm actually honored and grateful that I was able to do this little introduction to Michel's talk. I hope that you have found at least something of merit in it. And now, Michel, the floor, luckily, is yours.